This is a production of Cornell University.
It's a real pleasure to be here and speaking with you all, and it's really exciting to see how many people have joined us today. So thank you all for joining. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is really the landscape about what we know and what we don't know about food waste. And I'm really going to take you through the contemporary findings about how much food we waste, the impacts on the environment, and what we can do to help reduce our food waste. And what I want to do is, if we have time, to just follow up that discussion with some things that we can do both at the individual level, but then also at the system level. And I'm not sure we will have time to get to that, but if we do, I would like to share that with you. So what I want to do is really make the case that food waste is not just a public health issue. It's also an environmental issue. And I also want to stress that it's an economic issue too. It's an issue for affordability. So I'm going to be making those links throughout this talk today. So as many of you probably know, that 30 to up to 50% of the global food supply is either lost or wasted every year. And I want to talk a bit about that difference between food loss and waste in just a minute. But that is enough food to feed almost 2 billion people a 2,100 calorie diet per day. And at the same time that is all happening, about 820 million people are undernourished, which is a little over 1/10 of the global population. About a quarter of our fresh water, 15% of our cropland, and 15% of our fertilizers are used to produce food that ends up being lost or wasted at some point through the food system. And also, as perhaps many of you will know, that in 2015, the United Nations adopted Sustainable Development Goals, and they adopted a pretty ambitious target for cutting food loss and waste by half by year 2030. And just a few years after that, the USDA, EPA, and FDA signed a formal agreement to pretty much match that target, right? To reduce food loss and waste in the US by 50% by 2030. So this is a global effort, and also specifically a US effort. And what I'm going to be talking about today is really setting the stage at the global level, but a lot of my work is really focused on the US level. So I'm going to start broad, and I'm going to continue to kind of refine that into what's happening at the consumer level in the US. But like I promised, we need to make this distinction between food loss and waste. And this is problematic because there's different definitions that are used. And these different definitions vary depending on the scientists that are employing them, the agencies, right, that are defining them. And it's hampering our efforts to really measure food loss and waste if we can't settle on a firm definition for what that is. That also varies depending on the part of the food system that we're referring to. So what I'm going to do is just to lay out a definition, a working definition for each of these that we can just refer to throughout the rest of this talk. This is also the definition that I use in a lot of my research. There's definitely room for improvement, but I think that these are pretty good working definitions. So food lost, I think, is just easiest to think of as the inedible portions of food that are thrown away. So you can think of pits, cores, there's some seeds, some peels that are inedible, or at least really, really challenging and pretty uncomfortable if you do end up consuming them. And also don't taste too great, so people just end up not consuming things like, for example, banana peels. But for every time that I give a talk like this, I always get maybe a student or somebody in the audience who assures me that they have actually consumed something like a banana peel, and it's not as terrible as we might think it is. But for the general audience, I think it's fair to say that those are broadly considered inedible. And then food waste, I think it's easiest just to, and pragmatic too, to consider that to be the edible portions of food that are discarded. And this is the important point, that they're discarded for any reason. So this includes spilling the food at home, right? This includes food that might have, um, you may not have purchased it spoiled, but then it's spoiled in your home. So this is not a matter of value judgment. It's not a matter of who's at fault, but just the fact of the matter is that at one point, this food was edible and now it's no longer edible. So there's other reasons too. Some people just have a distaste for leftover food. People prefer food that's not blemished, even if it's perfectly edible and perfectly safe to eat. And the list really goes on. So this is just a quick sampling of the reasons that food ends up getting wasted. And I also want to make the point too that although a lot of what we're going to be talking about, especially later on in this talk, is what's happening at the consumer level, food waste and food loss is occurring at every stage of the food system. And the food system, as you know, a lot more complex than I'm depicting here, but I think that this is just kind of a quick schemata of how food is lost and how food is wasted at these kind of three major stages of agriculture through the supply chain and at the household level. So at the agricultural level, there's more data that's needed on this, but right now what we're saying is there's more loss than there is waste, right? And I won't go through each of the reasons why food is lost or wasted at each of these sectors, just in the interest of time. But I've just listed a few of the examples here in each box just to give you an idea. The supply chain is just an overgeneralization of many, many different sub-stages and processes in the food system, which I've included in the footnotes. But what we're seeing is there appears to be about a similar amount of food that's lost and a similar amount that's wasted throughout the supply chain. And then at the household level, what you're seeing on the far right of your screen in that darkest orange, we're seeing a lot more food that's wasted than is lost. So here we're looking at the global level, right? And we're looking at both food loss and waste. And we're looking at different stages of the food system. So not actors, right? So we're not looking at who is doing the waste, but we're looking at what part of the food system that loss and waste is occurring. So what this is showing is that at the household level, this represents 61%. At the global level, 61% of food that is lost and wasted. And this, by the way, is from a recent UN environmental program report that came out just last year. About 26% of food loss and waste at the global level is occurring at the food service stage. So places where typically where you would be eating outside of the home. And then where you're purchasing food, generally purchasing it for consumption at home, about 13% of that food loss and waste is occurring. So just think of, for example, supermarkets. Now, a lot of what we're interested in is not just where in the food system this waste is occurring, but really who is doing that waste. And when we're looking at stages, we kind of miss out on that critical nuance. So this is why I'm mentioning this, is because if you consider that consumers, right, are responsible for the waste that occurs in the household, consumers are also responsible for a portion of this waste that occurs in the food service sector, right? Not all of it. So some of that loss and waste will because you eat out at a restaurant and they've overstocked, or they've mismanaged some of their stock, or maybe some of their delivery was spoiled. Some of that is not the responsibility of the consumer, but some of it is, and approximately half of that is. So consumers are not always taking home the food that they're not consuming on their plate, for example. So this just shows that the consumer contribution to overall food loss and waste is much bigger than what you're seeing here. It's much bigger than the 61%. Now, also sticking at this global level, what we're seeing is that household level food loss and waste appears to be similar across countries by income level. So if you are looking at the y-axis, this is kilograms of food loss and waste per capita per year. And on the x-axis, this is GDP per capita in thousands of dollars. So you can see that there's really no observable trend. You would think that there would be, it's often thought that there might be more waste that's occurring in higher income countries. And the data are still limited on that, but this is what we're seeing. This is the most contemporary data that we're seeing at the global level. And we're seeing that there is no discernible trend in food loss and waste by income across countries at the country level, right? And there's a few reasons for that we think that could be contributing to this phenomenon. For one, we see that lower income countries, there's a considerable amount of waste that's occurring earlier on in the food system, right? And this is because of inadequate food storage technologies, because of challenges in maintaining cold storage, in logistical infrastructure, in political management of resources. But we're seeing in higher income countries a lot of that waste that's occurring in the latter part of the food system, right? So in the consumer level. Now, it's an open question right now about what this trend would look like within countries, right? So for example, in the US, are higher income households wasting more than lower income households? That right now is an open question. There's some data that are trickling in, but right now we just don't know yet exactly what the demographic characteristics are of these high or low wasting households or individuals. So that really is an area for fruitful research to come. Now, I'm going to present just some of my work interspersed into this presentation here. And this is some work that we had done a few years ago, but this is actually continued on in a number of different ways currently. This is looking at consumer food waste specifically, and specifically in the US. So remember, we started out very broad, looking at food loss and waste at the global level, and we are all throughout the food system. And now we've kind of honed in to waste specifically at the consumer level specifically, and in the US specifically. So what we're seeing is that on average, Americans are wasting, it's a little bit less than 1 pound of food per person per day. And this is about a quarter of all of the food that's available for us to consume. And we're also seeing that healthier diets are associated with greater amounts of food waste. And this appears to be largely driven by fruits and vegetables. So let me just walk you through this. So here, this bar chart on the left-hand side of your screen on the y-axis, this represents daily per capita food waste in grams. And in the x-axis, this represents diet quality. So on the leftmost bar, this lightest color orange, this represents the lowest diet quality, right? So the lowest adherence to, say, the US dietary guidelines. And this rightmost bar, this darkest orange, represents the highest diet quality, right? So this is on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 being the worst and 100 being the best diet quality that perfectly adheres with the dietary guidelines for Americans. And so this bar right here, this horizontal dashed bar, this is the average. So that's about 422 grams per person per day. And as you can see, as we move from left to right of this bar chart, we're seeing that as diet quality increases, the amount of food waste also increases. And so this is a linear increase. And this, when we did this research, this was actually pretty surprising to us. So we dug a little bit deeper into this. And what we saw was, when we look at the total amount of food that's wasted, we are seeing, and this is, I'm referring to this pie chart here on the right-hand side of your screen, we're seeing that almost 40% by weight of that food that's wasted is fruits and vegetables. And behind that, about 17% is dairy. Behind that, 13% is meat, and then grains and sweeteners. And beyond that, we get into very small proportions of total food waste. So this is largely driven by fruits and vegetables, which dominate in healthier diets. And we're also interested in the environmental impacts of this food waste, right? And also what I'll share with you after this is how those environmental impacts may vary depending on your diet quality. So here what we're looking at is the amount of harvested cropland that ends up being wasted, right? And so this is land that is used to produce food that ends up being wasted by the consumer. So on the y-axis, we're looking at the percent of harvested cropland. On the x-axis, this is our types of land. So total, what we're seeing is about 7%, about 30 million acres of cropland are used to produce food that's eventually wasted. But as you can see that when we take a look at fruits and vegetables, we're seeing about 55 to 65% of our fruit and vegetable land ends up being wasted. And here again, what we're looking at is how these environmental metrics of food waste vary depending on diet quality. So again, for each of these panels, we have diet quality as the x-axis going from the lowest on the left to the highest diet quality on the right. And this first panel is looking at cropland, right? So we're looking at on the y-axis, million acres of cropland that are wasted every year. And what we can see is that as we go from the lowest diet quality to the highest diet quality, we are seeing actually a decrease in the amount of cropland that ends up being wasted. But the picture looks different, right? When we're looking at other metrics like irrigation water and pesticides. Irrigation water on this middle panel, you can see that as we go from lowest to highest diet quality, that amount of irrigation water that we're wasting increases. And we see something similar with pesticides too. As we go from low to high diet quality, we see that the amount of pesticides that end up being wasted on food increases as well. So this is surprising to many people too. And we think, well, it seems to be that fruits and vegetables are largely responsible. I don't want to over attribute it to fruits and vegetables, but 40% of that waste is attributable to fruits and vegetables. And why is it though that we are seeing less cropland that's wasted as we increase fruit and vegetable intake, but we're seeing more waste of irrigation water and pesticides? And that is because fruits and vegetables are part of a categorization that we use in agriculture that we refer to them as specialty crops. So fruits, vegetables, and nuts and seeds. And specialty crops are largely, this is a little bit of a generalization, but it's a helpful one, I think, is that they're largely intensive crops. So they typically aren't requiring a lot of cropland, but they're requiring a lot of inputs, right? So we're talking about irrigation water and agricultural chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides. And you can just compare that to the other category that we use, which is field crops. So those field crops are extensive, right? So we're growing them on very large swaths of land, and per unit of land area, they're not using as much chemicals and irrigation water. Now on an absolute level, right, because we're growing so much of them, they do use a lot, but not on a per acre level. So those extensive crops, those field crops are grains, typically grains and oil seeds and feed grains. Also forages. And we also see that food waste in the US accounts for as much greenhouse gas emissions as approximately 33 million passenger vehicles. And we are embarking on some more contemporary research to bring this in line with more contemporary data right now as we speak. So our message is really that consumers should try to be doing two things at the same time. One is improving their diet quality, but at the same time, reducing their food waste. There is this idea that it's out there, and I engage in many spirited discussions about this that we, based on all of the available data, I think it's pretty clear that we need to be moving beyond this concept that if we just improve our diet quality, that's necessarily going to be good for the environment. We see that that is the case in many cases, but there's also cases where that doesn't pan out. There's many ways to eat an unhealthy diet. There's many ways to consume a diet that's bad for the environment. And the reverse is true as well. And they don't always line up. And I think we've been misled into thinking that if we just do one of those things, if we just eat a healthier diet, it's always going to be better for the environment. And what happens is that leads to cases like this, that we consume healthier diets, but we're not aware that these healthy diets, because they include so many fruits and vegetables, and fruits and vegetables are highly perishable and wasted in very high amounts, that can sometimes lead to the high amount of food waste and the attendant environmental consequences. So we want to see that people are doing both of these things at the same time, increasing healthy diet, right? And also reducing the amount of food that they waste. So this begs the question of why people waste so much food. And I'm just going to point you to what I think is the most important finding from this particular table. And that's what's highlighted in the bottom left. And so people were asked to estimate how many people, right, compared to the average American, how much food is wasted, right? And so this is what people reported, that they waste less food than 73% of people said that they waste less food than the average American, right? So 3/4 of people said that they wasted less food than the average American. And that doesn't add up mathematically, right? So what this tells you is that people are underestimating the amount of food that they're wasting. They're thinking that they're wasting less than they actually are. So some common reasons that people report discarding food. So the two highest reasons are a concern about food poisoning and a desire to consume only the freshest foods. And these are valid concerns, right? But what we see is that some of the leading reasons that people are discarding edible food is because of a misunderstanding over date labels. So those are what we just colloquially refer to as the expiration dates on food. And those are not standardized at the federal level, with the exception of infant formula. Those are not standardized at the federal level. This is done at a state level, which is the reason why you see this hodgepodge of different terminology that's used. So you see sell by, best by, freshest by, sell before, best before, and the list goes on. And consumers are perceiving these dates to mean the absolute last day that this food is safe to consume. And really what these are intending to mean is an approximate day that you can use as a guideline for freshness. And really what we want is for people to be using this information in tandem with all of the other information that consumers are able to glean from foods, right? So how does it smell? What does it taste like? What does it look like? When did you buy it? What were the conditions that you bought it under? Was it transported home safely? Was it damaged along the way? And we really, for people that have full capacity of their sensory perceptions, right, that are not immunocompromised, I recommend that people are using all of the tools in their skill set to determine whether that food is safe to eat. Now, if I, for example, have milk and it's past the date label and it hasn't been opened yet, then I'll open it, I'll smell it, I will maybe take a taste of it, I'll take a look at it. I will use that milk. Now, not everybody feels comfortable doing that, and you should definitely err on the side of safety. So if you are concerned about whether the food is spoiled, and again, if you have limited capacity of your sensory perceptions, if you have, if you're in an immunocompromised state, then you definitely want to err on the side of safety. But otherwise, I recommend that you use all the tools in your toolkit to decide whether that food is safe to consume. Now, for me personally, if I had milk that was unopened and it was a month past the date label, I personally would decide not to consume that. I'm going to err on the side of safety there, but different people are going to have different ways of being able to discern that. And overall, we do see people throwing away perfectly edible food just because it's just a day after the expiration date and it is likely safe to consume. People also say that they will throw away food because they don't think that it costs much money. At the same time, and this is interesting, at the same time, people also report that they would, one of the leading motivators to reduce their food waste would be saving money. So this tells us that people really are not aware of how much money they are actually spending on food that ends up being wasted. So this was some work that we had done just a couple of years ago, looking at the amount of money that we're spending at the consumer level on food that is both lost and wasted. And what you're looking at here on the y-axis, this is the daily per capita expenditure on food. And we break that up into all food that we're consuming, and then also food that we're just consuming at home and food that we're just consuming away from home. And then within each of those bars, we're also splitting that into food that is inedible, which is the blue, food that's wasted, which is in the green, and food that's actually consumed, which is in the red. And as you can see, the total amount of money that we're spending on food is approximately $13 per person per day when we factor in the amount of food that, the amount of money that we're spending on food away from home. For a lot of people, they may not realize that we are spending about half of our food budget on food away from home. And for a lot of the reports on the amount of money that we're spending on food, that additional cost on food away from home is typically not represented. So this is much higher than people were previously aware when they were only looking at the amount of food that we're spending, amount of money that we're spending on food at home. But take a look at the amount of money that we're spending on food from all sources, right? We're seeing that about 60% of that is food that's actually consumed. The rest of that is wasted and inedible. So over a quarter of our food spending actually is on food that ends up being thrown away. And you can see that as a proportion of the amount of money that we're spending on food at home and also food away from home, we're saying approximately the same. We're saying a little over a quarter of that expenditure is food waste. And when we take a look at that over the course of the year, we're seeing that that's about $1,300 per person. So that is the annual cost on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we're looking at food waste in the leftmost bar, that red bar. But then I think it's helpful to compare against other outlets that we're spending money on, right? So we're spending more money on food waste than we are on vehicle gasoline, on clothing, property taxes, household utilities, and that list goes on. So this does amount to a substantial amount of money. And we think that this is, when we talk about certain levers for behavior change, what we'd really like to see is this being incorporated into behavior change campaigns, that we can make people more aware of the amount of money that they're spending on wasted food. And we think that that would be one of the drivers to help motivate people to reduce their food waste. We also look at this by food group, right? And we see that the majority of the amount of money that we're spending on wasted food is meat and seafood, which are relatively expensive compared to other food sources. But we also see, not too far behind that, we see about 30% of our food waste expenditure is on fruits and vegetables, followed by grains, sweets, and dairy. So what we also see is about 35 to just over 40% of people say that either they throw away food, they feel comfortable with that because they compost it, right? And so the implication is that that doesn't have an environmental impact. And others say too, again, about 35% say that they're not concerned about the food that they discard because it breaks down in the landfill, with the implication being that the environmental concerns are mitigated. So I won't go into a lot of detail on this because our next speaker, Mark Morgan, has expertise in these issues, and he's going to be discussing some of the more contemporary and really exciting areas for mitigating food waste and their environmental impacts through landfilling. But I'll just say briefly that with composting, what you're looking at here in the top right picture, this is an at-home compost. This looks particularly well managed, where you have the new food scraps that are deposited here. And then you have this, looks to be almost fully composted here on the left, and they're just transitioning from one to the other. And then this is more of a municipal composting facility. But the point that I want to be making here is that composting is not environmentally neutral. Composting is a much more preferred strategy than just a conventional means of just landfilling. But composting is also contributing to this greenhouse gas cycle, right? And again, this does not mean that composting is always very harmful for the environment, but it also doesn't mean that it's neutral for the environment either. And there is a recycling that's going on, but it doesn't reach net zero. So we still need to be mindful of the amount of food that we're even generating into the compost cycle. Now, with landfilling, and again, our next speaker is going to be speaking with much more expertise on this issue, but just as an introduction, landfilling is currently the most common food waste management strategy in the US. Food waste represents over 1/5 of the mass of the matter in landfills. And food waste is the third largest source of methane emissions from landfills. And we see not just methane emissions, which are a particularly potent greenhouse gas, but we also see carbon dioxide emissions from the aerobic digestion in landfills. So this is just to say that composting, and certainly not landfilling, are not a environmentally beneficial or even neutral means of discarding food waste. And the people that are feeling the third and over, in some cases, 40% of our peers that are not bothered by food waste because they feel that it is being environmentally mitigated in compost and landfilling. That notion needs to be corrected. And I find this really helpful, this Environmental Protection Agency food recovery hierarchy. This is just providing us with just general framework for how we should be prioritizing our mitigation efforts around food loss and food waste. So our most preferred option, and this is something that we should always keep in mind, is not wasting in the first place, right? So this is doing what you can so that you're not putting more food on your plate than you're going to consume. And if there is more food on your plate than you can consume, to, if possible, to find a way to store it safely so that you can consume it later. And the list of those options goes on, but the goal here is to avoid wasting in the first place. You can see that next are donating food. That can only really be done in a really meaningful way through canned, packaged foods. There are absolutely ways to do that for fresh fruits and vegetables. It's just much more common to do it for canned and prepackaged foods because they have a longer shelf life. But there are absolutely ways to do that for fresh fruits and vegetables, and there's creative ways that are being implemented right now. It's just we see that that's not quite as common. And obviously, if you all have waste on your plate, for all intents and purposes, that really is not donatable, right? It's really food that is safe to consume because it hasn't entered your plate yet. There's options for feeding that food loss or waste to animals that would be largely for for livestock. Those options are limited, and I don't think that we should really think of our livestock as this primary means for disposing of our food waste. But there are some circumstances that's an option. There's more creative industrial uses. So we're able to generate energy from the methane that's emitted from certain landfills and also from manure storage facilities. That is not universal, right? But that is increasing. And then you can see towards the bottom of this list, right? We have composting, right? And then we have landfilling. So we really do, I think that this is, we can critique this, and in some cases I do think that we should, but overall I think that this is a helpful framework that can help guide us to where we're really putting most of our efforts for reducing food loss and waste. And you can see that most of our efforts really should be going to source reduction, to avoiding that waste in the first place. So I actually do have a couple more slides. I think we have a little bit of time. I'm just going to share with you some of the options that we have for reducing food waste at the individual level, and then also at the system level. There's a lot to say here, so I hope you'll forgive me as I just kind of give a surface level introduction to this. So this was a report that came out recently by the National Academies of Sciences, and this was a high-level report where they provided some of their recommendations for reducing food loss and waste at the system level. So they organized this into different pathways, right? So this first pathway that they're proposing is changing the US food environment to help discourage waste by consumers. So they're proposing a whole range of ways to do this. You can see that harmonizing date labeling is among those. They're proposing innovation in the food industry through linking the private sector, right? So this is governments at multiple levels, at the federal, state, local levels, industry levels, that would be private, but then also at the academic sector, right? And creating these where the federal government can come in is facilitating these collaborations, right? So that we can really push the needle on really, really creative ways to implement these strategies at scale. This second pathway is really to empower consumers, right, to reduce their food waste. So they're suggesting a national behavior change campaign, which would include influencers, for example, and ways to really reach populations, say younger populations, that might not be otherwise reached through what have become these more conventional messaging techniques through the federal government and through state and local governments. And also engaging and developing these methods for instructional and experiential learning about food waste literacy in early education. And then this third pathway, right, is leveraging and then applying research findings and technology to support consumers, right, in their efforts to reduce food waste. So we need more federal investment and support on measuring food waste, right? So how exactly are we going to be measuring it at the consumer level, at the household level, at the municipal level, and how are we going to make those data available for researchers, for scientists in both academia, in the private sector, and also in the public sector to engage meaningfully with this research? And how are we going to also promote the dissemination of those research findings, right? Open access. So there's many individual level strategies. I'm just going to highlight a few of these out of the interest of the limited time that we have left here. One, and this is something that I had already talked about, is just being mindful that wasted food means wasted money. And remember that most people do report that saving money is their biggest motivator to reducing food waste. So increasing awareness, not just about how much food we're wasting, but about how much money we're spending on that wasted food. Other tips, people can be more discerning about their use of coupons or other discounts, promotional techniques that lead them into purchasing more food than they actually need for themselves or for the household, right? So this is empirical. People are reporting that they are purchasing more food than they really need because of these reductions in price per unit that they're actually getting for food, and that leads them to purchase more than they're actually needing. Again, and I won't belabor this point too much more, but using these food labels, these date labels, as an approximate guide for freshness rather than the absolute last date that food is safe to consume. Of course, I want to reemphasize this, that if you are immunocompromised or working with an immunocompromised population, or you have any limitation in sensory perception and your capacity for taste, smell, or any other sensory capacity, then you really should be erring on the side of safety. There's also some creative phone apps that have been developed and more coming out that help consumers plan their food, so their food purchases, food storage, food cooking, right, to minimize food waste. And all of these, not all of these, many of these are now available for free for download on your phone. And I will actually conclude this presentation now. We went through a lot today, and I thank you all for joining us. And I thank you to the Cornell team for inviting me. And I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was a fantastic overview and brought us many different places in the whole spectrum of the food system and food waste. I'm going to launch a poll for people to fill out while we're doing the question and answers. So if you could just toggle those switches on the poll, that would be great. The first comment was, I appreciate the definition. Oops. Kendall said, I appreciate the definitional challenge and also seeing the avoidable versus the unavoidable as a useful distinction. So, right, we all have to get our vocabulary in line. Richard asks, the US imports a lot of fruit and vegetables in off-season. Were these imports included in your figures? If not, since these are produced on non-US land, wouldn't this skew the crop acres?
Yeah, and thank you, Kendall, for that feedback. And Richard, thank you for your question. So this imports were included in our estimates. We did not disaggregate imports from food that was grown domestically. And you're absolutely right that when we look at metrics, when we attach our food waste to metrics of agricultural chemicals and irrigation water and other agricultural resources, including cropland, you're right. This is we're really applying metrics from the U.S. right? So this is a data limitation issue. This is because of the massive amounts of high quality data that we have in the U.S. And in other countries, this is not true of every country, but we don't have as high of data quality as in other countries as we do in the US for agricultural resource use. So that limited us to some extent. And you're absolutely right that was a limitation of our studies, that one, we weren't able to disaggregate that. But then two is that it was a generalization about agricultural resource use just because of the limited data availability that we had.
Following up on that, I'm going to ask a personal question, which was, I think you said that fruit and vegetables account for 40% of our waste in the US. And so this is also an accounting thing. Is that a function of the high water content of the vegetables, or are you doing it on pounds of product, or are you doing on a sort of proportion of the nutritional or caloric intake on the diet? So I'm just wondering if your data might be skewed just simply because of moisture content as opposed to proportion of the total diet. Does that make sense?
It's a great question. So we've looked at it a few different ways. What I presented was that about almost 40% value was based on the total weight, so that would include moisture. But we've also analyzed it in dry weight too, and we see a similar ranking where fruits and vegetables do come out on top, but we see that it's not quite 40% any longer. But still, what we're looking at is somewhere between, say, 25 to say 30%. But fruits and vegetables are still coming out very much on top too.
Okay. Leslie asks, If you have old milk, but you boil it to make a latte or some other drink, will it be safe?
I wouldn't use it as a way to, I personally, I would just get new milk if you think that your milk is spoiled. I will say too, though, that a really good, I'm not a registered dietitian, and I just want to be fair that registered dietitians, I've had many conversations about this issue, and it's been made very clear that standard training with registered dietitians, and if there's any of you in the audience, you can correct me on this, but my understanding is that as part of the standard training, it is to really pay close attention to those date labels. So I would, I'm coming at this from a research perspective, not from a clinical advice perspective. And if you have any clinical concerns, I would speak to a registered dietitian. But from my own personal perspective, if I had milk that I thought was spoiled, I would just get new milk. I wouldn't boil it.
To follow up on that, I noticed in one of your later slides, you said that dairy food waste is only 5% of the total, and considering it's so perishable. Like, do you have any, I mean, there's lots of wisdom embedded in that. Do you have anything that could help inform the other sectors? Because that was notable.
Yeah, it was surprising to us as well. It was still ranked among the top, but yeah, by absolute amount, it was much smaller than we had anticipated as well. And we weren't able to fully discern why that was from the data. So that is actually an area that we're interested in exploring, is what is it about dairy specifically compared to other animal sourced foods like meat and seafood, why that would be less. It's possible that, and this is just speculation, but it's possible that people are able to, it's much more of a staple in the household, and people are much more able to buy the specific amount of dairy that in different size containers that they can use. You can also purchase your dairy from, at least for fluid milk, for different from different outlets, for example, like convenience stores, where you can just buy small amounts at a time. But what I think is really contributing to that is the much longer shelf life that you would have for processed dairy products like cheese. So for fluid milk, high perishability; for cheese, they have much longer shelf life. And we think that if we separated the cheese from the fluid milk, we would see a much different contribution there.
All right, Peter, do you want to ask your questions?
Sure, thanks so much. Again, covering a lot of territory. I'm just curious if I appreciate you sharing some ideas about approaches for reducing food waste. I'm wondering if you know of any research that's tried to quantify the efficacy of any, specific kind of interventions or programs, and how effective they might be, especially like in relation to the intensity of the effort.
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that comes up a lot. And I'll say too that I'll just respond to that question, and then I'm afraid I will need to depart. I just have another engagement that I need to attend to. There's this has been an interesting phenomenon with food waste. It was one of those issues. This also happened with the obesity epidemic to some extent, is that we realized it was a really big issue long after it became an issue, right? So these data arrived kind of on our desk, so to speak, and we said, holy cow, this is a really big issue. And we look back at the trends, and we're like, this has been an issue for a long time. It hasn't been fully addressed. So what that means is that right now what we're seeing the funding for those interventions a little bit late to the game, right? But now it's really been, this is something that we hadn't seen in just a few years ago. Now we're seeing $10 million grants being awarded from the federal government to address this food waste issue. And there's some great work that has been geared up. This is by no means complete, from my understanding, been geared up out of Johns Hopkins University from Ronnie Neff and colleagues, and also at Ohio State University. And also there's been some work out of the UK on this issue. And there's been some initial findings on some things that can be done at the household level to help reduce food waste, but right now we're waiting for more of that data to come in on are those findings stable across households of different demographics? And then what about when we aggregate that to county, state, district, province, national level? Those data are still coming in. So I don't have a firm a disaggregated answer for you, Peter, but it's a great question. It's something that comes up a lot. And I am just eagerly awaiting that research that's hopefully going to be coming out soon from those groups that have landed these mega projects.
Well, thanks so much. Just a quick tie-in back to our theme of greenhouse gas reductions. Greenhouse gas mitigation, it would seem like if you're saving money, then the cost would be below zero, right? So I think we should be also recognizing that even if there's a cost to the intervention, there might be a very low or benefit financially to reducing food waste. So in terms of greenhouse gas reduction strategies, it seems like this should be getting far more attention than it's getting.
Great.
Lovely final comment, Peter. Thank you so much, Zach, for your time today.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.